Good afternoon, welcome. We're going to have a look a bit at privilege. It's an uncomfortable word because it implies advantage, and it's something that we don't consider very much. Yet, it turns out it's inextricably linked to safety outcomes in the workplace. So I'm going to immediately hand over to the first of my panel, Catherine Evans, to introduce the wheel. We also have wonderful Hugh Maxwell here with us as well. So Catherine, if you'd like to talk just a little bit about privilege.
Well, I introduce this when I talk about privilege in the Institute of Worrying. I have a photograph of myself, Vanessa, who is our friend from NAWIC, the National Association of Women in Construction. Then there's Rosie, and there's Andy on the end. And I introduce privilege. Everybody looks at me, and when I had my head half shaved, they weren't particularly impressed with me standing there talking about how all the men in the audience had all this privilege and I had none. So I tried to soften the room slightly with this photograph to show that me and Andy were actually exactly the same. As a white woman, there's not really much that I don't have other than gender. But then we looked at Vanessa, who is black. We look at Rosie. We see differences. They were all slightly different, all up and down, and suddenly the room then starts to soften. I'm not enemy number one anymore when they realise that I'm actually on their side. I would just like to give them some information. So, the wheel, if you tick a lot of these things, then suddenly you don't have a lot of privilege at all. If you tick not very many, then you do. But it's all different. You can't look at somebody, there's a few things that you can see within them, but you don't see everything, because they may be neurodivergent, they may have come from poverty, they may have health issues that you're unaware of, and all of these things can change how much privilege a person actually has.
And certainly, looking at the research, we find that a lot of these characteristics are directly tied to safety outcomes, as I've said. There's a really interesting study about socioeconomic status and driving risk, for instance, that regardless of the vehicle that's being driven or the environment that's being driven in, socioeconomic status affects accident involvement and accident severity. We find also with migrant workers, it would be very easy to picture a construction site with a crew of migrant workers and thinking that they're automatically more at risk because of their migrant status. It turns out they're not. When you control for tenure and experience, the differences in accident involvement falls away entirely, so why am I even mentioning it? I'm mentioning it because of serious incident involvement and fatalities. Migrant workers are 70% more likely to be hospitalised as a result of an incident at work. They are 100% more likely to be disabled as a result of that accident. So you can have two people standing side by side on your construction site, one who is a native of the country, the other one who is not, and one of them is at a massive disadvantage to the other, despite the fact we've got the same controls in place. We are providing the same equipment, they're doing the same work. One of those two people is far more likely to be not just injured, but seriously injured. I think, Hugh, your experience in India would probably talk to that.
Very much so, Rosie. India, where we know there's a prevailing caste system, which some people accept, some people don't. Working out in the mining industry in South Africa, even working in other parts of Asia and around the world, they don't have the similar infrastructure we're trying to adopt here through the Equality Act, which has started the ball rolling to focus more in the area of privilege and trying to get much more parity for everybody. But again, because culturally they're very different, because the cost of life is much cheaper in some of these places than sadly. They don't perceive it as the same. So the actual weighting and the actual proportionality of the actual privilege is somewhat different there. Some of these people are taking even greater risks than we would perceive acceptable across the developed world. So again, as Rose said, India in particular, having experienced it firsthand in the steel and the family industry, and then seeing it in a different dimension underground in the mining industry, it's very much more indicative of just how much the wheel of privilege can actually impact upon risk in the workplace.
And it doesn't need to be just that kind of environment. My background is originally as a research scientist working in laboratories. I do remember in one of the labs I was working in, we had someone of high caste and low caste. And there was a real inequality because the person who was of lower status was expected to do things like washing up the glassware and setting up this other person's experiments. And so these were research students where the work is meant to be your own endeavour. So we see these subtleties come in, these interactions that we wouldn't necessarily see if we saw two people standing side by side, yet it's directly impinging on occupational risk. So in front of you, you have got a copy of the wheel. And we're going to do a little exercise where I'm going to encourage you to just mark out where you are. And you can do this, and then what I want you to do is talk together as a group about what kind of effects that might have in the workplace. So this is somebody of high privilege. Now, it would be very easy, don't get started on this, we're not quite ready for it. It would be very easy to look at the three of us and think, high privilege. That wouldn't be a surprise. So, I've mapped out my own. Does that surprise you? I'm actually somewhere in the middle in terms of socioeconomic privilege. I've got it in some areas, but I don't in others. And that does matter, because in a lot of in a lot of arenas around the world, that means I'm treated differently. Now, I am not appealing for sympathy here, because I'm doing very well, thank you very much, despite this. But it goes just to show that you don't see what's going on behind the scenes. I'm autistic, I'm transgender, I'm high-functioning depression, I'm gay. Now in the UK that probably doesn't matter too much. But it can matter. And certainly it probably doesn't matter so much in my sector of pharmaceuticals, but it might matter in other areas. So, you all have the wheel of privilege in front of you. Let's spin it and find out where you are. But more to the point, start thinking about how this might impact other people in your world of work and how we might not be seeing those risks. We're going to wander around in a minute. To our lovely sound people, you'll need to turn off our microphones in just a moment. And we'll come round and discuss at the tables. Then please nominate someone to give feedback. And we're going to have a bit of a discussion about what we might be able to do about this in the workplace. So, to give you some examples, for instance, as to how privilege directly impacts safety outcomes at work. Hopefully you've all had an opportunity to start thinking about that and taking a look at where you fit on this wheel. Whether you're at that end or that end. And it's very different. Some of you myself in my 50s, I'm an EHS director, I'm the president of the Institute. I've transcended any disadvantage that I might inherently have had. But if you're a 25, 22-year-old on the shop floor of a factory, this is going to matter. So, feedback from the tables. Is anybody volunteering to go first, or do I pick on people? There we go, in the centre here.
We did have two separate conversations.
Would you like to go first? Sorry. Just very briefly.
Hi, Andy from EWASH. Just my reflection was the fact that, of course, in some respects, we're on a journey with regards to these characteristics. So if I was to assess myself at the age of 18 versus 50-something, and I've been on a journey, and some of my characteristics change, some have not remained static, and I think that in itself reflects on the journeys we as a boarding organisation need to go through with our learners, and understanding our learners, our international learning community for us is particularly important when we are trying to reach and affect positive the lives as many people as possible. So understanding that learners' lived experience in 152 plus countries is for us is one of the lenses with which this sort of way of thinking, this sophisticated way of thinking holistically is quite powerful and quite valuable. So thank you.
Yeah, and this wheel might look different in different countries. What marginalises you may be different.
100%.
And that regional context, I know of certainly talking to some people in this room who work for big global companies, they have to be very aware of that regional context. So, sorry, there was some more feedback.
Remarkably, a very similar conversation on this side of the table. We did try to bring some of the wheel to life with stories and our social biases that we might not know we've got, but then come forward at a very at the moment you don't expect it. We talked about power and marginalised wheel. Would it look very different if we was in a different country? Would power look different to what power looks like on this wheel? Would it be inverted? So then that led on to that, people are very complex. And we talked about, do we all really fit in a box? Or are we a bit more general in our thinking?
I think there's certainly some dynamism there, and I think you're right. I mean, you look at how people probably felt during COVID compared to now, how you map your own personal footprint in that actual wheel of privilege then compared to now. And similarly, if we look sadly at how many youngsters nowadays are killing themselves because they just don't have coping strategies, they don't understand some of these different pressures, and I don't think they realise these pressures aren't going to be there forever. So I think there's not just we're talking about organisations, but I think there's also a duty in society for us to try and look at some of these factors and see what we can have in terms of actually a coping strategy or enable us to have a coping strategy.
I think for me what it underlines is that the workplace and workplace risk is complex. It's not complicated, it is complex. You pull on one lever and 6 others move. Right, let's pick on another table. I'm seeing a hand over here.
I think the takeaway that we had was the subjectivity, was that is that not only from the way that you might look at it it's subjective from your own perspective, but actually from someone else's position who doesn't actually see behind your position, it's subjective to actually you've got two sets of subjectivity going on.
And I think it's the internal subjectivity and the external subjectivity as well.
Agreed.
So, for instance, something that's not on here is attitude. Okay, I'm wearing one of Catherine's bowls of brass pens. I'm not short on attitude. Okay, so people will have different abilities to push through this and perhaps seek that reduction in risk in the workplace that they need, despite the fact they might be marginalised. Trouble is, they might then be labelled as a troublemaker.
Agreed.
And Catherine, why are you on the stage? Because you're like me, a fellow troublemaker.
Yeah, I like pointing at problems and fixing problems, but in pointing at problems, you usually point out somebody else's mistake. And not that I ever do it intentionally to get anybody in trouble. To me, the problem just needs to be fixed so we can move on. But because we live in such a society that likes to blame, even though we say there's no blame culture here, there's always a blame culture. And people feel silly for things that they should have seen. Only I see things differently because of the experiences that I've had, because I'm a different place on the wheel, because of my gender, just because of the way my brain works. So I wouldn't expect anybody to see it exactly the same way as me. The only problem is then you really do get something stuck to your back of you are a troublemaker, and it will pull your career down. And I think we need to make more of people who are happy to flip the lid of the status quo and want to make change. Because right now, people are holding on to status quo and continuing to allow these environments to be created and sustained, where people who aren't average, who aren't the expected, they aren't able to come in and they aren't able to succeed, to thrive, even just to stay, just to be.
So we've had some great feedback in this side of the room. We've got some volunteers over here. Fabulous.
Hi, thanks. Luke Epstein from Marsh. We were similar to some of the points that were made over there. I know you went as far as a different country, but we found that if we're looking at a perspective of within Marsh, how would we consider ourselves compared to our peers that we work with? That would be different, our privilege compared to where we live, for example, so what parts of the country we come from. So that was something that was quite interesting. And then we also talked about how much it's changed if we were to do this wheel for our parents and everything that they've gone through, and they've progressed from an outer wheel into the centre to give us that privilege and what they've gone through. So it's that perspective of how it changes. So we are essentially the same as our parents, or similar to our parents, but we've gone through maybe completely different experiences.
Yeah. And it's hugely different for us sitting here in the 2020s in the UK to perhaps, well, a lot of perhaps the African or Asian regions, South America. If we were to even dial that back a number of years, it might be very different. So I was in Berlin earlier in the month, went to the Stasi Museum, was hearing about forced labour in the in East German prisons. So it's very contextual. And we are on a journey, you're quite right. So, anybody else perhaps down this end?
Hi, it's Louise from Citation here. Similar discussions to what gone on across the other side of the tables. I think the point you make, had we all completed these tables 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever, it would have been very different to what they are now. And you use the word transcendent, I love that word. It's, maybe there were barriers, maybe whatever it may be, but, I potentially would have got a very different wheel 10, 15 years ago, whatever it's took to get to this point. Which then makes me think, what about those who don't get to do that? What can we do as an industry, as a team, to help other people get into the positions they can and to be safe and protected? And I'm chatting with David from University of York, wasn't it? Dave from University of York was around some of the assumptions. We don't know some people's barriers, so we meet them on face value. We might think they're privileged, but we don't always know what's going on behind it. So
we make an assumption that somebody feels that they can speak up. And we're making that assumption from our own point of privilege. and actually they might have something they want to contribute that they don't feel able to. So there's another study that speaks to this, and it was done in a couple of London hospitals, and they were taking a look at socioeconomic status and accident involvement, and along with quality of management. And what they found was, regardless of what was being done, those who were more socially disadvantaged were more likely to be involved in severe accidents. But what they actually found was that that was mediated strongly by line manager support. And where line manager support was poor, we would see more accident involvement, but that was also then exacerbated by socioeconomic status. But what was interesting was even up at the top end of the socioeconomic status, which the group in there was hospital administrators and surgeons, they were 4 times more likely to be involved in a serious accident if their manager was not supportive. So this then brings us through into a discussion about care within the workplace. And actually, an awful lot of this is mediated by our line manager. Anyone else want to chip in? Got one here. Greg?
Excuse me. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Our table, I think, sort of epitomised what everybody said and also what we thought. We're ostensibly look pretty much the same as far as profile goes, but how we've arrived has been completely different. And if you look at our profiles, they have changed over time, which I think somebody else made a comment. But for us, the interesting one was, what would this look like on an organisational level? And how does that relate to organisational identity and culture? Because that comes back to everything as far as both management and what we're valued in the organisation. What would this look like? Again, I appreciate it over time. It would have been very different 15 years ago. Although, having said that, if you look at the UK's notwithstanding the difference in riddle due to change, if you look at the UK's major accidents and fatalities over the last 10, 15 years, how much have they changed? Very, very little.
Yeah, that's it.
So I'm going to turn to my panelists and challenge them and say, what can we do about this?
Well, I was going to say the psychological safety, for me, is the biggest thing. Well, we can't assume that somebody feels that they can speak up about their self, their whole self. This whole thing of bringing your whole self to work, where the environment isn't even safe to bring half yourself to work. It's the psychosocial environment. There's a psychological safety within the group. How we react to things, having a listen up culture, not just a speak up culture, because you need to know what was the thing that happened to the last person who spoke up. Did it end well? If it didn't end well, or there are rumours of it not ending well, then you are going to quash what you're trying to create. I think trying to fill companies full of diversity before addressing the culture is a massive problem. Because as somebody like me, who's always been the only working in the mining industry, it's hard. It's hard going to be the only. And it's difficult then to not feel like a victim. Because you are victimised, you take a lot. We talk about how it rolls downhill, and it would roll downhill onto me quite a lot. But understanding that you need to work on your culture, how to work on culture, to make it safe, not just physically safe, but mentally safe as well. For me, that's how we go to make a change, and it's a long way, but we have to start somewhere, and small chunks is what it will be.
And what might this look like in your current role, munitions and things like that, diffusing songs?
Well, it's very much I'm working on one project in the Baltic Sea where we're actually looking after 4 vessels and a couple of team of divers who are actually moving World War I, World War II and Cold War missiles from the subsea before they can put cables down for wind turbines. So obviously because it's quite military, it's quite disciplined, it's working with general authorities. Some of these things have already been detonated, some haven't. There's very much command and control, but I think it comes down to strong leadership. For this in particular, the leaders themselves have got to understand the impact that the wheel of power, wheel of influence can actually have within their organisation, and how they can actually use this to actually allow some of the hidden talent in there to come through and speak up. And it's creating this visible felt leadership in whatever environment. Obviously, it's something where it's quite rigid, you've got to follow the rules, it's very proceduralised and regulated, it has to be. But in most organisations now, we've moved away from that to try and make it much more flexible, to allow the diversity, to allow inclusivity. But I think there's a long way to go before we actually address the issues of mental wellness, mental well-being, and a tool like this allows us to do that.
And actually you're talking there about command and control, and yet we're talking about psychological safety. And that trust element, and those two sometimes sit opposed to one another. And I think it's actually understanding that command and control sometimes in a particular task might be required, but you can't do it without psychological safety and trust.
That's a question.
Please.
Sorry, Matthew from AXA. And this is the second time. Can we see the mic, please? Got a little bit of a head start. Take the mic.
Hi, sorry, Matthew from AXA. I was just saying this is the second time I've seen this with our privilege work, and it's a very useful exercise, certainly really thought-provoking. The question I had was, are there examples of kind of like poster childs of organisations that have really understood this, implemented this kind of way of thinking within the workforce and operations? What are some of the tangible things that they have actually done to sort of facilitate this being understood, worked upon, and ultimately having the outcomes of a safer environment for everybody?
I'm certainly looking potentially at one person in this room who's got the visible felt leadership very good and understands the different sites and slightly different approaches and metrics that are adjusted, and he's nodding so I can pick on him. So I would say L'Oreal are actually inherently good at this, whether they've actually had this at the core. So I don't know, Malcolm, if you'd like to say a little something there about that.
Now I feel embarrassed. No, I think part of, if you think about it, part of our business is appreciating sort of, diversity, inclusion, etc. So within L'Oreal, I mean, we have quite a lot of training for all the managers so they understand the importance. And we do psychological safety training, but in the way that Amy Edmondson first came up with it, which is all about high-performing teams. And now in high-performing teams, you can only be high-performing if you give everybody a voice, including the rookie, etc., and you don't drive people down. The wheel of power privilege is the second time I've come across it as well, if I can. I actually took it back and did some stuff with my team, and we found it very useful for personal reasons. It's very difficult sometimes. People don't necessarily always want to be honest with the people around them. But what it does, it helps you understand yourself. But yeah, visible felt leadership as well in L'Oreal is very, very, very important, solely because it's important for my boss, it's important for me. And we believe that a lot of the drive comes from the leader around psychological safety, acceptance of people for being who they are. And we're all on the journey. We still have people in L'Oreal that do not appreciate people that are diverse, right? But they're on a journey, and I think part of our role is to help people go on that journey.
We have another comment over here. here, so all the microphones come up. And Matthew, I was just going to say that this session very much was a response to the challenge that you made at the President's reception last year for data.
I also have an answer to that, so Google. There was a study done by Google, I can't remember what the name of the study was, I think it was a Greek god's name, but they pulled a lot of information to do that. I'm not sure if Amazon did something similar. Yeah.
Hello, this is Mahmoud Darwish. Thank you very much for holding this session. I think the Health and Safety Guidelines number 48, which issued by HSE, has a great explanation how we can reduce the human error, and it's divided into 3 factors: organizational factors, job factors, and individual factors. So if we implement this standard, I think a lot of human errors will be eliminated, and that will be very helpful.
And you're absolutely on point. The guidance out there on human error, and in fact, actually, there is a really good risk assessment tool that's now been published by the Energy Institute that was authored by Masan Nasruk, about bringing human factors into proactive risk assessment, and actually being able to proactively look at our human factors and how they might influence outcomes. There's a superb graphic in there about both physical and individual person hazards and organisational hazards, and it builds on the work that Diane Chadwick-Jones was leading at BP, in fact Marsan worked for her. So you're absolutely right, this is very much part of this human error, human factors, HOP.
Yes, one of the previous accident that I investigated is the operator switch on the pump, then he ran to open the valve. The correct procedure is to open the valve that's in front of the pump, and then switch on the pump. So also the ability is one of the individual factors and the training. Thank you very much.
Okay, so any more questions for the panel? We have about 10 minutes remaining, so please grill us. Oh, hands. Excellent.
Hello, Christian from DECRA. I've worked for a couple of different membership organisations around HSE, and I wonder what their role is in translating this into sympathetic membership fees and strategies to recruit and engage more members. Because if diversity matters that much, then it's in your power as a body to actually do something about it.
And I'm actually looking at my fellow trustees who are sitting over here. We are having exactly that conversation around how to engage more internationally. But what I would say is I think fees are only one part of it. I think it is about being able to be relevant in the different arenas as well. And I think, Jonathan, you're probably attuned to comment, but...
Yeah, I'm happy to do so.
So, can we have a microphone to Jonathan? Hey, sorry, I can just feel the buzz over there.
Hello everybody, my name is Jonathan Bainey, RSM trustee. You make a very brilliant point there, and something that we have been discussing on the RSM Board of Trustees for a good part of about 6 months now. We're actually coming together with a strategy to be able to see how best we can help other professional members from less privileged countries or within continents. So we're looking broadly at Africa and Southeast Asia, and we have a working committee, and we are definitely doing some work on that because we acknowledge that we have to be able to use our privilege to be able to open membership to the less fortunate. So it's a conversation that we're having, and hopefully very soon we'll be able to share more concrete things and be able to see what best we can do using our privilege. But I also want to make a point. privilege, talking about privilege is very uncomfortable. And a lot of people, especially those that are central to power, feel very uncomfortable when we talk about privilege. I think even though there are so many different aspects to the whole wheel of power and wheel of privilege, personally I'm surprised that this is the first time I'm seeing this. I'm a bit embarrassed actually, because I've never seen this before, I've never come across it, but I think it's a really powerful tool. And the observation that I've been able to make in such a short time is that a lot of people, especially that are central to the power, feel embarrassed to be associated with power, and it's worth acknowledging, because people that are core to this feel very uncomfortable and don't even want to admit that they are central to power. That is the main thing that I think we all have to acknowledge. And because of that, there's a phenomenon of disassociation. People that are core to power, central to power, a lot of times, I don't know what it is, but they tend to try and play to be on the peripherals, they look like they're marginalized, and it's worth acknowledging. Another thing that I want to say is that they're not all the same, all the different aspects of the wheel of power, and that is an observation that I've made. The ones that are not visible, I'm not saying that they're less important, but especially the ones that are more visible, they are very overwhelming and they are overarching. And I'll make an example. So for instance, skin color. I'm not just saying it because I'm black, so for instance, I could be black and a citizen, but a lot of times it's even very difficult to make a case that I'm a citizen. Fellow British people will not even accept that I'm a citizen, or you have to go above and beyond to prove that you're a citizen. So in that case, you can see how skin color overrides citizenship.
Absolutely, we're seeing that in the United States about social media.
Exactly, yes.
Too much, but we're actively seeing that. So yes, not all of these count equally. Absolutely.
Thank you very much for that. And that's the point, exactly the point that I wanted to make. So there are a few phenomena that I've actually observed, and I've talked about the first one, the phenomenon of dilution. And a lot of times, people that find themselves central to power, a lot of the actions that they do tend to dilute the feeling of those that are marginalized. So for instance, you could say people that are highly educated at some point would probably say that, oh, I'm not educated. What do I know? Anyway, I think I digress a little bit. But just to answer the question that you made, challenging your panel, what can we do to help the situation, if you like? And I think there's a call to action there, and it's very important that people that are central to power don't feel embarrassed by it. They shouldn't. They should own that privilege. They should own being powerful and use that for good.
Yeah, I think I will respond to that, say, own your privilege.
Exactly.
Recognise that you have it, and then ask yourself what you can do to use it for good. So I've been doing some work, for instance, with the Workplace Safety Association in Kenya, with a group in Ghana, and trying to help them through what I can do, which is through webinars and interaction and mentoring. So, I'm going to say, because we are, I think now, more or less out of time, so I'm going to ask one last word from the panelists.
Well, from my perspective, please recognise your privilege, you said. If you are in a position where you can help interact and work with others, my international experience, I do take into account my privilege relative to the people I'm working with, and try and use it, I can build the trust, build the respect that they deserve and they warrant to raise their performance and get the best out of them.
And the same as to own your privilege, and the way that I own my privilege is volunteering with QuinJac, which is the Quarries National Joint Advisory Committee, as the mental health and wellbeing chair, because I was given a way to talk about my emotions as a child, and I was allowed to talk about them, whereas the 84% of people who I work with, men, they aren't able to. And I was stood with a man just yesterday who told me that he had a bit of a wobble the night before because he's from Alabama. And if you are Welsh, you will know the story of Alabama very, very well. And he told me how his brother drunk and sent himself to death because his brother survived. PTSD that stayed with him as he told me he watched his friends slip away. That has not just stayed with him, but stayed with his brother, and he has lost a second brother. And to have somebody just bring all of this out, and I only just met him, he was just a visitor, a contractor to our site, to understand how strong you are as just a voice, as a pair of ears, somebody who will be helping somebody else by being able to talk, and you've been given those skills, just honestly use them as much as you can.
So what I think I would ask all of us, and what I would leave you with is, what's the one thing you can do tomorrow when you're at work to start using your privilege to help others? I'm going to give you an opportunity, something that actually you might be able to go and do, based off what Catherine was just saying. The British Standard 30480 went out for consultation yesterday. That is suicide in the workplace. Go and look up 30480. The consultation is open. Comment on it. Help make that the strongest thing we can do. Because we are all privileged enough in this room to have both the education and the time to do that. But what else can you do? Is it mentoring somebody? Is it getting out on the shop floor and engaging in that visible felt leadership? My favourite quote is from John McCarry, and that is, "A desk is a dangerous place from which to view the world." And we sit at that desk with our privilege and view the world accordingly. So, how are we going to use it? Can I have a round of applause, people, please? I believe we're having a short break. Yes. Okay. We will see you back here for the next session.